The bag weighed 4 pounds, maybe 5, cracked along its seams and stained the color of old coffee. Nobody in that lawyer's office thought it worth fighting over. She took it without a word, the way she'd taken everything else her whole life. The early mornings, the broken fence line, the silence. What none of them understood, not the lawyer reading from his yellow legal pad, and not the cousins already checking their phones, was that the old man had spent 14 years hiding something inside its stitching that would outlast every acre he'd signed away. The desert does not mourn quickly. It was early spring when he died, and the mesquite hadn't yet gone green, and the wind that came down off the ridge that week carried grit that got into everything. The coffee, the bed sheets, the folds of her collar at the funeral. She found him at dawn in the equipment barn, one hand still resting on the tractor's cold fender, as though he'd simply decided to sit down mid-sentence. She was 31. She had lived on that ranch since she was 21. 10 years of mornings that began before the sun cleared the Calico Mountains. 10 years of fixing what broke because nothing on that land ever stayed fixed for long. Her cousins came for the funeral in rental cars still smelling of the dealership. One worked real estate in a glass tower off Wilshire. The other sold ideas about other people's products to other people who didn't need them. They had visited twice a year, at Christmas and sometimes in August, always leaving before the heat got serious. They called the ranch Grandpa's place, the way you'd refer to a cabin you were fond of but didn't have to clean. At the cemetery outside Barstow, the thermometer on the funeral home's sign read 104 degrees. The granddaughter stood in the only black dress she owned, the one she'd bought for her mother's funeral years before, and did not cry where anyone could see her. Her hands, she noticed, would not stop moving, smoothing her skirt, checking her watch, reaching for a tool that wasn't there. 10 years of habit does not know how to stand still at a graveside. 11 days later, in a lawyer's office with a rattling window unit and a framed photograph of the ranch taken sometime in the 80s, the family gathered to hear what the old man had decided. The lawyer was an older man, tired in the particular way of someone who has read too many wills to strangers who used to be children he watched grow up. He cleared his throat twice before he began. Outside, a truck idled in the gravel lot, engine ticking as it cooled, and the granddaughter found herself listening to it instead of to the first lines of the document, the legal language, the careful accounting of 640 acres, of water rights, of cattle and trucks and a windmill that had turned since before she was born. She did not yet know to listen for her own name. Mr. Halbrook read the way men read when they want the words to matter more than they do, pausing after each clause as if giving the room a chance to object. To my grandson, Trent Calloway, I leave the north and east parcels, comprising 410 acres, together with all cattle, the flatbed truck, the stock trailer, and the windmill at the north well. Trent's jaw did something small and satisfied, a muscle easing. To my granddaughter, Whitney Calloway Reyes, I leave the south parcel, comprising 200 acres, together with the equipment shed, the tractor, and all water rights appurtenant thereto. Whitney did not smile. She simply nodded once, the nod of a woman confirming an invoice. The lawyer turned a page. The window unit rattled, caught, rattled again. To my granddaughter, and here he said the name that had spent 10 years answering to it in barns and pastures and the cab of a truck at 4 a.m. I leave my leather tool bag and the 40-acre parcel bordering the ridge, known to the family as the back acreage. There was a silence of the kind that has weight. Then Whitney laughed, not loudly, not unkindly on the surface, the practiced laugh of someone used to smoothing over discomfort in conference rooms. "A tool bag," she said. "That's almost funny. That's the one thing even the auction house wouldn't take." Trent leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, and looked at his cousin with something that might have passed, from a distance, for affection. "Guess Grandpa's love language was scrap leather," he said. "Don't spend it all in one place, Deli." No one laughed with him. Mr. Halbrook did not look up from the document, though his pen paused a half-second too long over the signature line, as if he too had expected something different, had perhaps argued for something different in some room she would never be shown. She did not answer either of them. She thought, instead of the bag itself, sitting even now in the bed of her truck where she had thrown it after the barn that morning, its handle stitched twice where he had repaired it himself with waxed thread and a curved needle, patient the way he was patient with everything that still had use left in it. 40 acres of rock and creosote bordering a ridge no cow had grazed in a decade, a bag that smelled of neatsfoot oil and diesel and 40 years of his hands. She folded her own hands in her lap and said nothing, and outside the window the truck in the gravel lot finally shut its engine off, and the desert went quiet in the particular way it does at noon, when even the insects seem to be waiting for someone to move first. Mr. Halbrook read the parcel description last, the way a man reads the fine print he expects no one to care about. 40 acres, assessor's parcel number appended in a string of digits nobody in the room bothered to write down. Rocky back acreage bordering the northern ridge, deeded separately, outside the main 640. He read it the same measured way he had read the water rights and the cattle tally, and the itemized list of trucks and trailers, and when he finished, Whitney exhaled through her nose, a short, dismissive sound, as if confirming something she had already suspected on the drive in from the airport. "That's the part he couldn't sell," Whitney said. Not quite to anyone. Even he must have known it was worthless. Trent leaned back in the leather chair, tilting it on two legs the way their grandfather had once told him, more than once, would put his neck through the drywall. Good thing it's going to the one who doesn't need the money anyway. Nobody corrected the cruelty of that sentence. Nobody in that office was in the business of correcting them. Halbrook set the will down and squared its edges against the desk blotter, a small, private gesture, the kind of thing a man does when he needs his hands occupied while his mouth stays professionally still. He had known their grandfather for 22 years, had drafted 3 earlier wills before this one, had sat across a different desk in a different decade while the old man argued about a heifer that had wandered onto a neighbor's allotment. He did not offer commentary now. That was not his role, he had told her once, in the hallway outside this same office, on some earlier errand she couldn't place anymore. His role was only to read what was written and let the family do with it what families did. Outside, heat came off the asphalt in visible ribbons. She rode back to the ranch with the truck's air conditioning broken, both windows down, dust filming her arms brown by the time she reached the gate. The cattle guard rattled the same as it always had beneath her tires. The windmill turned, slow and complaining, the way it turned every day of her life since she was 21. She parked beside the equipment barn and did not go in. She had not gone inside it since the morning she'd found him there, and she suspected she would put off entering it for a long while yet, maybe longer than made sense to anyone who hadn't loved a place enough to be afraid of it. The bag sat in the truck bed where she'd left it, cracked along one seam, buckled tarnished green. She did not open it that day. She told herself there would be time later, once the ranch was settled, once the auction papers were signed, once there was less noise in her chest to sort through first. She had no way of knowing then how long later would turn out to be. The auction house came for the equipment first, a Tuesday in late April, when the heat had not yet reached its full cruelty, but had begun rehearsing for it. Men in clean boots walked the yard with clipboards, tagging the tractor, the flatbed, the old disc harrow that had not turned soil in 3 years, but still sat oiled and ready because that was how he'd kept things. She watched from the porch step, arms crossed, saying nothing, because there was nothing to say that would change the numbers on the tags. Trent had flown in for the day, sunglasses pushed up into hair that had never known desert wind before this, and he walked the property like a man measuring a room for furniture. Whitney did not come at all, only sent instructions by email, forwarded twice through the lawyer's office, regarding percentages and wire transfers. By the second week of May, the cattle were gone, sold in a lot to a rancher out past Kramer Junction who did not ask questions about why she was the one loading them, not the men whose names were on the bill of sale. By June, the water rights had transferred, a stack of paper thinner than she'd expected, for something that had kept 100 head alive through droughts she remembered by name. The windmill kept turning for a while after. absurdly, uselessly, until someone came to take that too. She found work where she could. A garage in Barstow needed someone who understood diesel, and she was good at diesel, better than good, and for a few weeks it felt almost like enough. Then the owner's nephew came home from trade school needing hours, and she was let go with a handshake and a comment about how she'd always be welcome to come back if things opened up. Things did not open up. She drove to Victorville and slept 2 nights in a motel before the money made more sense spent on gas than on a bed. And after that, she slept in the truck, seat reclined as far as it would go, the tool bag still in its place in the bed box, riding along through all of it like luggage she'd forgotten to unpack. She did small jobs, brake pads for a woman with 3 kids and no husband listed anywhere in the conversation, a timing belt for a trucker who paid in cash and complimented her steady hands. She ate less than she should have and told herself it was temporary, the way she'd told herself in April that grief was temporary, the way she'd told herself in May that anger was. The bag went unopened through all of it. She used the tools inside it, a wrench here, a screwdriver there, without ever disturbing what lay beneath the tray, without ever running her hand along the stitched seam at its base, which had begun, by then, to separate slightly from the leather around it, patient, waiting, the way everything on that ranch had learned to wait for her. By June, the heat in Barstow had a texture to it, something she could have described to a stranger the way other people described rain. It sat on the hood of the truck at 9 in the morning and did not move. She learned to work before 7 and after 6, and to spend the hours between them in whatever shade the day offered, usually the flat gray shadow thrown by a Quonset hut behind the parts store on D Street, where the owner, a heavy-set man named Escobedo, let her sit if she swept the lot after. She kept a ledger of sorts, though she would not have called it that, a spiral notebook with jobs on one side and money on the other, and she balanced it every night the way her grandfather had balanced his feed accounts, in pencil, so mistakes could be corrected without shame. $40 for a serpentine belt, $60 for a starter she'd pulled from a wrecked Silverado in a junkyard outside Hesperia and rebuilt on a folding table. She was, by July, undeniably good at this. People began to ask for her by name, which meant nothing in terms of money but something in terms of the hours passing. She did not call Trent. She did not call Whitney. Once, in early July, Whitney had texted her a photograph of a closing statement, the 600 acres, the water rights, the equipment, all of it converted into a single number, with a comma in the wrong place for a rancher's daughter to look at without flinching, and beneath it, no caption at all. Delia had stared at the number for a long moment and then set the phone face down on the dash and gone back to the transmission she was rebuilding, because there was nothing in that photograph that required an answer. Her own truck, meanwhile, was failing her in the patient, incremental way old trucks do. It hesitated at idle, it hitched going up the grade past Kramer Junction, a small stumble in the engine's rhythm that she diagnosed without needing to raise the hood. A fuel line, probably, cracked somewhere along its run, letting in air where air had no business being. She did not have the money yet to fix it properly. She drove around the problem instead, taking the flatter roads, coasting the last quarter-mile into Escobedo's lot on fumes and stubbornness. The tool bag rode behind her seat now, moved there sometime in June, when she'd needed the bed box for a transmission pan, and it sat against her spine on every drive, close enough that she sometimes forgot it was leather and not simply part of the cab. She had stopped noticing its weight. She had stopped, if she was honest, thinking of it as her grandfather's at all. It had become simply hers, a box of tools that happened to smell faintly of neat's foot oil and cattle dust, no more sacred than the jack in the bed or the tire iron under the seat. Which was, perhaps, the only reason she was able to open it fully when the day finally came, without her hands shaking. The day came in the last week of September, a Tuesday, the kind of flat gray morning the desert produces when it cannot decide on weather. She had parked behind the Shell station on the old highway, the one with the bay Escobedo let her use after hours for $10 and a promise to sweep up, and she had the truck's front end lifted on jack stands that had seen better decades. The fuel line problem had finally announced itself fully 3 days earlier. A stall at 40 miles an hour outside Hinckley, the engine catching and dying and catching again, like a man clearing his throat before bad news. She could no longer drive around it. She would have to go in. She set the bag on the concrete beside the front tire and unbuckled the 2 brass fasteners, worn smooth as river stone, and began pulling tools the way she always did. Wrenches first, laid out by size on a folded shop rag, then the pliers, then the small tin of cotter pins that rattled like teeth. She was hunting for a flare wrench, the specific half-inch her grandfather had always kept wrapped in a chamois cloth at the very bottom, because a flare wrench was the only thing that would not chew the brass fitting to ruin. She emptied the bag entirely for the first time in her life. It came down to the last layer faster than she expected. The bottom of the bag was smaller than the bag itself, she noticed, an inch of stitched leather rising up inside like a false floor in a drawer. She had seen it before without seeing it, the way a person can look at a photograph for years and never notice what is standing in the background. She ran her thumb along the seam. It was tighter than the rest of the bag's stitching, newer, done by a different hand, not her grandfather's clumsy leather work with the awl he kept in the barn, but something closer to machine even, deliberate. She sat back on her heels in the gravel. There was a smell coming up from that seam, faint, like a closed drawer, like paper kept a long time in the dark. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself the bag was old and things settled and shifted in old leather, the way houses settled in their foundations, and that a rancher's tool bag had no business hiding anything but grease and rust. She believed this for perhaps 4 seconds. Then she reached for the smallest blade in the roll, a seam ripper she used for canvas repairs, blunt-tipped, patient, and began, very slowly, to work it under the thread. The thread did not want to give. It had been waxed, she realized, waxed and pulled tight the way her grandfather had once shown her to finish a cinch strap so it would never work loose on the trail. Pull, half-hitch, pull again. Whoever had sewn this seam had meant for it to hold. She worked the ripper under one stitch, then the next, feeling each one part with a small dry sound like a knuckle cracking. The gravel bit into her knees through her jeans. Somewhere behind her a truck passed on the 2-lane and did not slow, and she was grateful for that, grateful to be unwitnessed in this particular, foolish, deliberate act of prying open a dead man's tool bag as if it were a coffin. She had 6 stitches out before she made herself stop and breathe. It occurred to her, kneeling there with grease still drying on her forearms, that she had spent 5 months not doing this. The bag had ridden behind the driver's seat since the funeral, then in the truck bed toolbox since she'd sold the truck with the bad transmission, then back inside once she'd bought this one for $1,100 from a man in Victorville who hadn't asked why her hands shook when she counted out the bills. She had used its wrenches, she had used its pliers. She had never once turned it upside down and pressed her thumb along the bottom seam, because some part of her, the part that still woke some mornings expecting to hear the barn door, expecting coffee already made, had not wanted the bag to be only a bag, had not wanted to find out there was nothing more of him in it than leather and rust. Now here was a seam that argued otherwise. She picked the ripper up again. 7 stitches. 8. The leather along the seam had a give to it now, a slight looseness, like a scab ready to lift. She worked her fingers into the gap she'd made and felt, beneath the outer skin of the bag, something flat. Not tools, not the shape of a wrench or a folded rag. Paper. She was almost sure of it. Paper with the particular stiffness of something that had been folded a long time ago and never unfolded since, the fibers gone brittle at the crease. Her hands went still. For a moment she only knelt there in the gravel with the fuel line still disconnected on the truck above her, engine ticking as it cooled, sun coming low and orange through the tamarisk at the edge of the yard, and she let herself imagine, just once, before she knew for certain and could never again not know, that whatever was sewn into the bottom of her grandfather's tool bag had been put there for her, and no one else to find. Then she reached in and pulled it free. It came free with a dry, papery sigh, the sound of something exhaling after 14 years of held breath. Not one document, but two, folded together and pressed so long into that hidden pocket that they had taken on the shape of it. A rectangle no wider than a hymnal, the edges gone soft as cloth. She did not open them yet. She held them the way she might have held something alive, something that could still be startled back into hiding, and she looked at the empty seam in the bottom of the bag as if it might tell her more than the papers themselves. The gravel bit into her knees. She did not notice. When she finally turned back the first fold, the paper cracked faintly along its old crease, and she saw a line of typed text, faded to the gray-brown of weak coffee, and beneath it a signature she would have known blind, in the dark, after any number of years, the same signature that had once endorsed her paychecks in the ranch office, that had signed the papers for the water pump replacement, that had co-signed her very first loan on her very first truck. His hand, unmistakably his hand, below it a notary's stamp, embossed deep enough that she could feel its raised edge with her thumb even now, and a date, 14 years old. She read the heading twice before the words assembled themselves into meaning. Mineral rights. Some kind of deed, not the ranch's 600 acres. She knew that legal description by heart, had copied it out for insurance forms a dozen times, but a different one, shorter, unfamiliar, a parcel number she didn't recognize at first and then did, with a small cold drop in her stomach, because it matched the 40 acres of rock and creosote up along the ridge that nobody had ever wanted. The 40 acres that had come to her, almost as an afterthought, a footnote beneath the tool bag. The second document was thinner, stapled, its cover page bearing a letterhead she'd never seen before, a company name, a logo of overlapping topographic lines, an address in Reno. Basin and Range Geoscience. Beneath it, in smaller type, Preliminary Subsurface Assessment. The date matched the deed. She sat back on her heels in the gravel, the sun now fully down to the tamarisk line, throwing the yard into that flat orange light that made everything look older than it was, and she understood, in the slow way that true things arrive, that her grandfather had not simply left her a bag of tools and a scrap of land nobody wanted. He had built a hiding place with his own hands, stitched it shut with the same patience he'd once used to mend a saddle, and trusted that patience, hers, to be the thing that eventually found it. She had not even read the numbers yet. Her hands, she noticed, had begun very slightly to shake. She made herself set the survey down before she read it. That, too, was a discipline he had taught her without meaning to, the way he'd once made her lay out every socket before touching an engine, so nothing was lost in the dark under a truck. She wiped her palms on her jeans, though they were already clean, and only then did she pick the document back up and open it to the first page of text. The language was dry in the particular way of technical reports, full of qualifiers and disclaimers, and for a moment she thought it might defeat her, the way legal language had defeated her at the reading in Barstow. But she had spent 10 years learning to read manuals that assumed more knowledge than she had, and she did what she always did. She read past the words she didn't know and let the ones she did know build a shape. Lithium-bearing claystone, continuous zone, estimated thickness, grade consistent with economically viable deposits currently under development elsewhere in the basin. She read that sentence 3 times. Somewhere behind her a nighthawk called, that low booming dive she'd heard every summer evening of her life on this land, and the ordinariness of it steadied her more than anything else could have. The yard was going the deep blue of full dusk now. She should have been hungry. She wasn't. She turned to the last page, where a hand-drawn boundary line looped across a topographic map, marking the extent of the deposit as the geologist understood it 14 years ago. She held the map up against the fading light and traced the line with one finger, matching its shape against a memory she hadn't known she was keeping. The ridge above the old corral, the dry wash where her grandfather used to walk the fence line at first light, a cup of coffee going cold in his hand while he looked at nothing in particular, or so she had always assumed. The boundary line sat almost entirely inside the 40 acres. She looked at the deed again, her name, typed neatly beneath his signature, notarized 14 years ago, long before she had ever driven a truck onto this property for the first time. He had known. He had known when she was 17 and living 200 miles away, before she had ever lifted a wrench for him, before either of them could have guessed she would be the one who stayed. She thought of Whitney's voice in the lawyer's office, bright and certain. That's the one thing even the auction house wouldn't take. She sat very still in the gravel a long while, the papers held loosely in both hands, and did not yet let herself think the word that was waiting at the edge of her mind, the word for what a piece of paper like this, verified, notarized, and true, might actually be worth. That would come. For now there was only the fact of it. He had trusted her with something enormous, and told no one, and she had almost missed it entirely, tucked beneath a rusted latch she'd nearly thrown away twice. She folded the deed along its original creases, careful of the soft white lines where the paper had worn thin from being folded and unfolded once, maybe twice, 14 years before. Then she did what she had trained herself to do with any engine she didn't yet understand. She went back to the beginning and looked again, slower this time. The survey was still in the toolbox lid, its cover page facing up. Basin and Range Geoscience. A logo she didn't recognize, spare and old-fashioned, the kind of letterhead that belonged to a firm more interested in fieldwork than marketing. She turned to the second page, then the third. The language was clinical, dense with terms she didn't know. Lacustrine clay. Say. Brine-hosted concentration. Sow. Drill hole assay. But she had spent 10 years learning to read what mattered inside language she didn't fully own, the way she'd learned to read a compression gauge before she understood combustion theory. She found the map on page 6. It showed the ridge in cross-section, contour lines rising and falling like something breathing, and over it, hand annotated in blue ink, a boundary drawn tight and careful around a shape that mirrored, almost exactly, the outline stamped on her deed. She had seen that shape before, not on paper. On the land itself, walked 100 times, the ridge rising just past the old corral fence, the place her grandfather used to stand some mornings with his hat pushed back, saying nothing, looking at rock that had never grown a blade of grass worth mentioning. She had asked him once, years ago, why he never grazed cattle up there. Ground's no good for it, he'd said, nothing more. She had believed him, because there had been no reason not to. Now she sat with the proof that he had known something else entirely about that ground, something worth commissioning a survey for, worth notarizing a deed for, worth hiding inside a bag he wore every day of his working life so that no one, not the county assessor, not his own grandchildren, not even her, would think to look for it until he was gone, and it no longer mattered whether anyone objected. She thought of Trent's laugh in the parking lot after the will reading. Don't spend it all in one place, Deli. She thought of the check stub she'd glimpsed once, folded into Whitney's purse before it snapped shut. $9,000, an option payment for mineral rights on land Whitney had believed, wrongly, included every acre north of the fence line. She looked down at the survey again, at the date stamped in the corner. 14 years. She did the arithmetic without wanting to. She would have been 17, in another county, angry at her mother, unaware that a rancher 200 miles away had already decided, quietly, who he trusted to carry something this heavy. The gravel had gone warm beneath her from the morning sun. She did not move for a long time. Somewhere behind her, under the truck, the fuel line she had been repairing when all of this began, still sat half disconnected, forgotten, waiting for hands that were no longer thinking about engines at all. She made herself move, finally, because the alternative was to sit in the gravel until the sun climbed higher and cooked the thought out of her entirely, and there was too much left to do for that. She folded the survey along its original creases, the paper soft and cooperative, as if it had been waiting 14 years to be folded by someone who understood what it meant. The deeds she did not fold. She laid them flat on the passenger seat of the truck, weighting the corners with a socket wrench and a half-empty bottle of water. and she sat for a moment with the door open and her boots still in the dirt, looking at them the way she might look at something alive. There was a logic to it now, and the logic frightened her more than the discovery itself. He had not simply hidden papers. He had chosen a container no one would think to search. Not a safe, not a drawer, not the ranch office where Trent had spent one long afternoon after the funeral, going through file boxes with the particular carelessness of a man looking for cash and nothing else. He had chosen leather that would crack and darken with age, that would sit ignored in a truck bed toolbox for 5 months, because it looked like exactly what it was supposed to look like. Worthless. She thought about that word. Worthless. Whitney had used it almost affectionately, the way people use cruelty when they believe it costs nothing. The fuel line was still waiting under the truck. She did not go back to it yet. Instead, she walked to the tailgate and looked at the bag itself, emptied now, its false bottom peeled back and hanging open like a mouth that had finally said something after keeping quiet for years. The stitching along the seam was small and even, done by a hand steadier than she would have guessed his was in his last years. She ran her thumb along it and thought of him bent over the workbench in the equipment barn on some night she had not known about, threading a needle through leather with the same patience he'd used teaching her to bleed a brake line, to time an engine by ear, to read weather in the color of the sky over the ridge. He had not told her. That fact sat uncomfortably next to her gratitude, refusing to resolve into anything simple. He had not told her, and she would never get to ask him why, and there was no version of this where she got to stand in the equipment barn and say, "You could have just said something," and hear him answer. What she had instead was paper and a date, and a bag with its secret laid bare in the gravel outside a mechanic's bay in Victorville, and the growing, unwelcome understanding that none of it would matter unless she could prove, to people who would not want it proven, that the signature at the bottom of each deed was real. She folded the papers along their original creases, careful as a woman handling something that might crack, and laid them flat on the passenger seat where she could see them while she drove. The gravel lot emptied out behind her in the mirror, heat already rising off it in visible sheets though it was not yet 9. She did not go back to the mechanic's bay. She sat instead with the engine off and the windows down, and read the geologist's report a second time, slower, the way her grandfather had taught her to read a compression test, not for the number itself, but for what the number meant next to the one before it. The name at the top of the letterhead was Basin and Range Geoscience. She had never heard of it. She wrote it on the back of a fuel receipt in pencil, the only paper within reach, and beneath it wrote the date on the deeds, and beneath that a question mark, because 14 years was a long time for a secret to keep, and she wanted to know what her grandfather had been doing with a survey crew on his own land a decade and a half before anyone thought to ask what that land was worth. She thought of the years between then and now. 14 years ago she had been 17, still living with her mother in Adelanto, driving out on weekends to help him worm the calves. She tried to remember a truck she didn't recognize parked by the windmill, strangers with equipment cases walking the ridge in the white part of the afternoon when the cattle wouldn't move. She could not find the memory. Either it hadn't happened when she was watching, or she had been too young to think it worth keeping. What she could not stop turning over was the plainness of the man against the size of what he'd hidden. He had not worn it like a secret. He had worn it like nothing at all. Same boots, same complaints about the price of diesel, same Sunday habit of walking the ridge before the heat came up, hands in his pockets, saying nothing to her about what was beneath his feet. She started the truck again because sitting still made the thought unbearable. Halbrook's office was 40 minutes east. She did not know yet what a lawyer could tell her that a folded piece of paper couldn't. Only that paper alone had never been enough to hold against people who spoke in the tone Whitney had used at the will reading, the tone that assumed ownership of a room before anyone else had finished speaking. She would need someone whose word counted for more than hers in rooms like that. She merged onto the highway with the deeds riding beside her like a passenger she hadn't agreed to drive. The empty tool bag on the floorboard, its false bottom peeled back and gaping, and did not yet let herself imagine what the words lithium. And deposit might mean once someone with a license said them out loud. The office had not changed since the will reading. Same water stain on the ceiling tile shaped like a saddle. Same brass nameplate, dull at the corners from 20 years of hands pushing the door open. She sat in the chair across from him and set the 2 folded deeds on the desk blotter like she was laying down cards she did not fully understand the value of, and she watched his face instead of the paper, because she had learned long ago on the ranch that a man's face told you what a document could not. He read slowly. He read the way he had always done things, without hurry, without performance, and she made herself sit through the silence of it without filling it with questions. When he finally looked up, he did not smile. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, and the gesture frightened her more than any words could have, because it was the same thing he'd done 11 days after the funeral, right before he'd told her what she would not be getting. "These are notarized," he said, 14 years old. His signature. I'd know it anywhere. I signed enough alongside it. He turned the survey report over, scanned the letterhead. Basin and Range. I know the name. Reputable outfit. Does mineral work all through the Mojave. He set it down carefully, the way she imagined he might set down something that could still detonate if handled wrong. "I want to be careful here, Delia. I'm not a mineral title man. What I can tell you is that these were never filed with the county. He kept them private. That's not nothing." Why would he keep them private? He didn't answer that directly. He never did, with questions that had no comfortable answer. Instead, he pulled a legal pad toward himself and began writing a name and a phone number in handwriting so careful it looked like it belonged to a much younger man. "There's an attorney in Bishop who does nothing but mineral rights disputes. I'll call her myself. Tell her who you are. Tell her what you have. You'll want her to confirm the chain of title before you say one word to anyone about what this might be worth." He looked at her over the pad. "And you will want to say nothing to your cousins. Not yet. Not until we know exactly what you're holding." She nodded, though the caution in his voice had already done something to her chest that felt less like fear and more like the first cold water on a burn. Outside, the parking lot shimmered with the same heat that had stood over the cemetery, over the auction, over every room that had told her what she was owed and what she wasn't. She folded the deeds back into the same creases her grandfather had pressed into them 14 years before she'd ever thought to ask what silence like his might be hiding, and she carried them out to the truck like something newly born, not yet named, not yet safe. The drive to Bishop took 3 hours, and she used every one of them to rehearse silence. It was harder than she expected, saying nothing, not to the man at the gas station in Lone Pine who asked why she looked like she hadn't slept, not to herself, in the mirror, where the truth kept rising up behind her eyes, like water finding a crack. She had spent 10 years learning to keep her hands steady around animals that could sense fear before she felt it herself. She used that same stillness now, driving north with the deeds tucked inside a manila envelope on the passenger seat, as if speed or carelessness might undo whatever had already been set in motion. The attorney's office sat above a hardware store, the kind of unglamorous address that made her trust it more. The woman who met her, sharp-eyed, unhurried, a stack of case files thick enough to prop a door, read the deeds twice before she said anything at all. Then she asked for the survey. She studied that longer. "Basin and Range doesn't do speculative work," the attorney said finally, setting the report down with the care of someone handling a photograph rather than a document. If they surveyed it, someone paid them to survey it, because someone already believed there was something under it worth confirming. "He never told me," Delia said. It was the first full sentence she'd spoken in an hour. "People who bury things this carefully rarely tell anyone," the attorney answered, not unkindly. "Sometimes because they're waiting for the right moment. Sometimes because they're afraid of what the wrong person would do with it too soon." She asked for 2 weeks to run the chain of title clean, county records, notarization logs, a call to the surveying firm itself if it still existed under the same name. Delia agreed, though 2 weeks felt suddenly like the longest unit of time she had ever been asked to hold. She drove home through the darkening basin with the windows down, the desert releasing its held heat into the night the way it always did, indifferent to what had happened on it or beneath it. She thought of her grandfather walking that ridge at dawn, hands in his pockets, saying nothing about what he knew was under his boots. She thought of Whitney's voice in the lawyer's office. The one thing even the auction house wouldn't take. And found, for the first time, that the memory didn't sting the way it had for months. It simply sat there, small and almost funny, the way an insult does once you've stopped needing it to hurt. The tool bag rode in the truck bed behind her, empty of everything now except its own worn shape, its own decade of use. She caught herself glancing at it in the rearview mirror at every stoplight between Bishop and home, as though it might still have something else to give her, some second lining, some other silence waiting to be undone. The 2 weeks did not pass quietly. She had thought, driving home that night, that waiting would feel like holding her breath. Instead, it felt like being handed a second job on top of the first. The calls, the copies, the forms Halbrook's office kept generating with a patience that made her want to scream into the glove box. She learned the vocabulary the way she had once learned the vocabulary of transmissions and hydraulic lines, by necessity, one term at a time. Chain of title. Severed estate. Bona fide purchaser. She wrote them on the back of a service invoice and taped it above the visor, where a rosary had once hung when the truck was still her grandfather's. The mineral title attorney turned out to be a woman named Coraline Ibarra, out of an office in Bakersfield that smelled of new carpet and old coffee, who spoke to Delia the way Halbrook never quite had, not gently, but plainly, as if the facts themselves were a kind of mercy. She spread the deeds across her desk under a gooseneck lamp and traced the legal description with a fingernail. County, township, range, section, the numbers Delia had memorized without understanding until now. Your parcel was never in the packet they sold, Ibarra said. Not the 40 acres, not the minerals under it. Whoever assembled that option agreement for your cousins either didn't check the plat or didn't want to. Delia asked which. Ibarra didn't answer that. She only slid a photocopy across the desk, a scouting company's boundary map, hand-annotated, the ridge outlined in red ink with Delia's parcel sitting inside that outline, like an island someone had forgotten to claim. They optioned dirt they thought was theirs, Ibarra said. It never was. Delia drove home with the copy on the passenger seat, weighted down with a socket wrench so it wouldn't slide onto the floor. She kept thinking of Trent's signature on some form somewhere, confident, unbothered, the way he signed everything, as if the world had always cleared a path for his handwriting. She thought of the $9,000, split evenly, that he and Whitney had each taken for a right they didn't hold. It was not triumph, she felt. It was something quieter and stranger, closer to vertigo, the sensation of watching a door that had always seemed shut turn out to have been open the whole time, unlocked, waiting for someone patient enough to try the handle. That night she parked at the base of the ridge instead of driving all the way to the trailer. She left the tool bag in the truck bed and walked up alone in the dark, boots finding the trail without her eyes, the way her grandfather's must have. Somewhere above her, invisible, undisturbed, the clay that had waited 14 years continued waiting. She did not go all the way to the top. She only wanted for a moment to stand where the silence started. The next morning she called the mineral title attorney whose name Halbrook had given her, a woman in Riverside with a flat, unhurried voice that asked for nothing but facts. She read the deed numbers aloud over the phone, then the notarization date, then spelled the geoscience firm's name twice because the woman kept writing it wrong. There was a long pause on the line, the kind that made her stomach tighten before she remembered she had nothing left to lose that hadn't already been taken. Then the attorney said she would need the original documents couriered, not scanned, and that a title search would take 2 to 3 weeks given the county's backlog. 2 to 3 weeks. She wrote it on the back of a receipt so she wouldn't forget, though she suspected she would remember the number the way she remembered the odometer reading on the truck the day her grandfather bought it. She did not tell anyone what she had. Not the mechanic in Victorville who still owed her for the transmission job. Not the woman at the motel front desk who'd started giving her the weekly rate without asking. She drove the original deeds and the survey to a copy shop in Barstow at 7 in the morning, before it opened for regular business, and paid the owner $20 to let her use the machine early so no one would see what she was duplicating. She kept one set in a manila envelope taped beneath the driver's seat of the truck, the way her grandfather might have hidden something he didn't yet trust the world to leave alone. For the first time in 6 months, she did not take a mechanic job that week. She sat instead in the shade of her tailgate off the county road, reading the Basin and Range survey line by line, the way she used to read a repair manual before touching an engine she'd never opened. Core samples, depth measurements. A phrase she didn't understand at first, lithium-bearing claystone, until she looked it up on a library computer in Victorville and sat very still afterward, the librarian glancing over twice because she hadn't moved in 10 minutes. She thought of her grandfather driving out to that ridge alone 14 years earlier, telling no one, paying a geologist in cash probably, filing paperwork under his own name in an office much like Hal Brooks. He had known. He had known for 14 years and said nothing, not to Trent, not to Whitney, not even to her, only left the knowing folded inside the one object no one else would ever think to open. She wondered, driving back toward the trailer that evening, what else in that bag she hadn't yet understood. The trailer smelled of dust and machine oil, the evaporative cooler ticking uselessly against a heat that had settled into the walls by noon. She set the bag on the kitchen table the way a nurse might set down an instrument tray, not casually, and untied the leather straps she'd already untied twice before. The false lining had given up one document. She wanted to know if it had given up all of it. She turned the bag inside out under the bare bulb, running 2 fingers along every seam the way she used to run them along a hose for a slow leak. Pressure, then release, waiting for the give. The stitching along the base was tighter, newer thread against older leather, hand-done, uneven, in a way that told her it hadn't been a saddler's work, her grandfather's work. She had watched him sew a torn cinch 100 times with that same crooked, patient stitch, tongue between his teeth, never in a hurry. Behind the first fold of lining, tucked flat against the leather like a letter slipped under a door, were 2 more sheets she had missed the first time, thin as onion skin, folded in quarters. She unfolded them slowly, the paper dry enough to crack at the crease if she rushed it. Deeds, mineral rights deeds, notarized, a county seal pressed faint but legible into the corner, his signature at the bottom in the same hand that had signed feed receipts and vet bills for 30 years. 14 years old, same year as the survey. She read the parcel description twice before it settled. 40 acres, the ridge acreage, the same rocky, useless-looking ground the will had handed her almost as an afterthought, the ground Trent had once called the ugly end of nowhere while loading his truck for the drive back to the city. She sat with that for a long moment, the cooler ticking, a moth working itself against the bulb. Whatever her grandfather had known, he had known it about her parcel specifically, not the 600 acres split between the cousins. Not the water rights, not the cattle, not the trucks with their good tires and low mileage that had gone to auction for numbers that made the auctioneer's voice rise with something like excitement. Hers, the 40 acres nobody had wanted enough to fight over. She thought of Whitney's voice in the lawyer's office, bright and final. The one thing even the auction house wouldn't take. She thought of it again, differently now, the way a sentence sounds different the second time you hear it in another language. She folded the deeds back along their old creases, careful not to add a new one, and slid them into a manila envelope she'd bought that morning, without admitting to herself why. Tomorrow she would drive to Barstow, not to the mechanic's shop on Route 58, where they still owed her for a transmission job, to the office with the frosted glass door and the name stenciled in gold that hadn't been repainted in 20 years. She wanted someone who had known her grandfather to tell her she wasn't imagining what she was holding. Mr. Halbrook's office smelled the way it had smelled 11 months earlier, when the will was read aloud over the hum of a window unit fighting a losing battle against the desert heat, dust and old paper, and the particular staleness of a room that had not been asked to hold good news in a long time. He looked older than he had at the funeral. He always did, she thought, each time she saw him, as though the practice of law in a town like Barstow aged a man in installments. She did not sit down before she put the envelope on his desk. He opened it the way he did everything, without hurry, sliding his glasses up from where they hung against his chest. He read the first deed in silence, then the second. Then he set them side by side, squared their edges with 2 fingers, and looked at the geologist's report for a long time without turning a page, as though the cover alone were saying something he needed a moment to absorb. "Where did you find these?" she told him. The false bottom, the second row of stitching, the 6 months the bag had sat closed in her truck bed while she told herself there was nothing left in it worth looking for. He took his glasses off. He rubbed the bridge of his nose the way he had done reading the will aloud, before Whitney's laugh, before Trent's line about scrap leather, and she understood suddenly that this was simply what the man did when he was about to say something that mattered. "I drew up his will," he said. "I did not draw up these. He never mentioned them to me. 14 years, and he never once mentioned them. Could he do that? Keep something from you?" "A man can keep anything from his lawyer he wants to keep," Halbrook said. "The question isn't whether he could, it's why." She did not answer, because she did not have an answer yet, only the beginning of one, forming the way weather forms on the far side of a ridge before you can smell the rain. He turned the survey toward her and tapped the corner of the map inside it, where a boundary line had been drawn in a draftsman's careful hand, and she saw for the first time what she had not let herself fully see the night before at her own kitchen table, that the line did not follow the fence posts her grandfather had built. It followed something else, something underground, something that had nothing to do with cattle or water or the 600 acres her cousins had been so satisfied to divide. "This needs a mineral title attorney," Halbrook said, "someone who can tell you exactly what you're standing on." She heard the word standing and thought of the ridge at dawn and did not yet understand why. The mineral title attorney worked out of a strip mall office in Victorville, wedged between a nail salon and a check cashing store, and she almost turned around in the parking lot because the smallness of it did not match the size of what she was carrying. But she went in anyway, the deeds and the survey in a manila folder pressed flat against her chest like something that might blow away if she loosened her grip. The attorney's name was printed in gold on frosted glass, and inside, the office smelled of burnt coffee and printer toner, nothing like Halbrook's leather and dust. He read slowly. He asked her to repeat the legal description of the parcel twice. He pulled up a plat map on his monitor and turned it so she could see, and traced the 40 acres with the eraser end of a pencil, and said, "This is yours, deeded to you individually, recorded 14 years ago, never touched since." Then he pulled up a second document, the option agreement her cousins had signed with the development scout, and set it beside the plat map, and was quiet for a moment, in the particular way of a man double-checking something he already believes. "They sold an option on land adjoining yours," he said. "Not on yours. I don't know if that was carelessness or if someone told them it was the same parcel, but it isn't. It was never the same parcel." She asked him to say it a third time, not because she doubted him, but because she wanted to hear it in a room that was not her kitchen, from a voice that was not her own hopeful one. He said it a third time. Outside, the heat had settled into the asphalt the way it did by early afternoon, rising back up through the soles of her boots, and she sat in her truck with the engine off and the folder on the passenger seat and did not start the ignition for a long while. She thought of her grandfather driving these same roads with these same deeds folded somewhere close to his body, saying nothing to no one, for 14 years. She thought of the word. Why? The way Halbrook had left it hanging, unanswered, in his office. She did not yet have the shape of the answer, but she had the outline of it now, the way you have the outline of a ridge before the sun clears it, dark, certain, and waiting. Somewhere north of Barstow, a national lithium developer's scouts were already circling parcels that were not hers, filing reports, running numbers that did not yet account for 40 acres deeded to a woman named Ortiz, who had never once put her name up for auction. The mineral title attorney's office sat above a check-cashing store on a street where the paint had given up years before the buildings had, and she climbed the outside stairs twice before she found the courage to knock a third time. His name was printed small on the glass, unassuming, the way she was learning to recognize the difference between men who needed their names large and men who did not. He read the deeds the way her grandfather used to read weather, slowly, without comment, letting his eyes move back over a line twice before speaking at all. He asked her 3 questions. When was the parcel deeded? Had it ever, in any transaction, been bundled with adjoining acreage? Had she signed anything, ever, that referenced mineral rights in any form? She answered each one the way she would answer a mechanic diagnosing an engine, plainly, without embellishment, because embellishment was for people who were not sure of their own facts. He set the papers down and looked at her for a moment longer than she expected. "Your cousin sold an option," he said. "Not a right. There's a difference. And it's the only difference that matters here." He tapped the survey map, the ridgeline inked in a hand that was not the surveyor's own but her grandfather's. Small notations in pencil along the eastern boundary. This 40 acres was never inside what they had to sell. They sold air. Expensive air, but air. She did not smile. It did not feel like a thing to smile about yet. He told her the title would need recording, the deeds refiled with the county, a formal notice sent to the developer's scouts correcting the boundary they had been quietly walking for weeks. He told her this could take another month. She said she had waited 6 already. He almost smiled at that, the first crack of warmth she'd seen in him. Then a month won't kill you. Outside, the light had gone long and orange across the lot, the kind of hour her grandfather used to call quitting light, though he rarely quit at it. She sat in her truck with the folder now official stamped and heavier somehow than it had been that morning, and she thought of the phrase the attorney had used. They sold air, and turned it over the way she used to turn a stripped bolt, looking for the one angle that would finally let it give. Somewhere past the ridge, survey stakes were already going into ground that would soon need to be pulled back out. The notice went out on a Tuesday, certified mail, 3 copies, one to the developer's regional office in Reno, one to the county recorder, one to a Los Angeles address she had to look up because she had never once had reason to write it down. She stood at the counter of the Barstow post office and watched the clerk stamp the receipts, and she thought that this was the least dramatic moment of her life to carry so much weight. No raised voices, no slammed doors, just a woman in a blue vest pressing ink onto paper, and somewhere 300 yards from a ridge she'd walked 1,000 times, a boundary correcting itself on record for the first time in 14 years. The developer's scout called 4 days later. His voice had the same easy confidence it must have carried when he'd first knocked on 2 doors in Los Angeles and walked away with an option for $18,000 total. It did not have that confidence now. He used words like clerical discrepancy and pending clarification. Words built to survive being repeated to a supervisor. She let him talk. She had learned that from her grandfather, too, that a man digging his own hole rarely needed help with the shovel. She did not call Trent. She did not call Whitney. She told herself this was patience, the same patience that had gotten her through 6 months of odd jobs and a truck bed for a bedroom, but some smaller, more honest part of her knew it was something closer to mercy, the kind you extend not because someone deserves it, but because you are tired of being the person who has to decide who does. Word travels faster in small counties than certified mail does. By the following week, a woman she barely knew, a former neighbor from 2 ranches over, mentioned at the feed store that she'd heard the Callaway land, she still called it that, out of old habit, had turned up some trouble with the mineral rights. Delia said nothing. She bought her fencing wire and left. That night she drove out past the turnoff, past the cattle guard that no longer belonged to anyone she loved, and parked where the road went to gravel and then to nothing. She did not get out. She sat with the engine ticking as it cooled and looked at the dark shape of the ridge against a sky gone the color of a healing bruise, and she understood, in the plain, unceremonious way truth arrives to people who have done hard work for a long time, that the correction was no longer a legal matter. It was only a matter of time before the phone in her jacket pocket rang, and she would have to decide what kind of woman she wanted to be when it did. The call came on a Thursday, at 11 in the morning, while she had her hands inside the transmission of a stranger's pickup in the Victorville Bay. She wiped her palms on a rag that had once been a shop towel and was now mostly stain, and she let it ring twice before she answered, because she had learned, somewhere in the last year, that answering too quickly gave a caller the sense that you had been waiting on them. It was Whitney. The voice was careful in a way it had never been careful before. Gone was the clip and polish of the will reading, the flat certainty of a woman standing in air conditioning while someone else did the sweating. What was left sounded almost like an apology, though it never once used the word. "I don't understand how this happened," Whitney said. "Our lawyer says the option we sold didn't cover your acreage, that it couldn't have been ours to sell." Delia did not answer right away. She watched a fly work its slow circle around the bay light. "It wasn't," she said. There was a silence on the line long enough that she could hear, faintly, the sound of a car door somewhere in Los Angeles, a city sound, traffic and glass and distance. Trent thinks there's some kind of mistake in the survey boundary. He wants to get his own geologist out there. He can hire whoever he wants, Delia said. It won't move the ridge. She had not meant it as cruelty. It came out anyway, sounding like some, and she found she did not mind that it did. She thought of the 4 months after the funeral, the auction flags snapping in the wind over her grandfather's corrals, Trent's voice saying, "Don't spend it all in one place, Deli," and something in her chest that had been coiled tight for a year loosened by one small notch. Whitney asked, finally, the question underneath all the others. "Is it really what people are saying? Is it that much?" "I don't know yet," Delia said, which was true, and which was also, she understood even as she said it, the last patient thing she would ever tell either of them for free. She hung up before the silence could turn into a request. She stood in the bay with the rag still in her hand, and the transmission still open behind her, and she thought, not with triumph, but with something quieter and stranger, that the old man had known exactly how long it would take them to notice what he'd already given away. The mining engineer came out again in the last week of the month, this time with a man from the developer's land office who wore a tie in weather that did not permit ties, and who kept glancing at his phone, as though the desert might interrupt the signal on purpose. They walked the ridge with a tablet between them, comparing boundary lines against the old survey pages, and every so often the engineer would stop and press his boot into the clay and say, low, almost to himself. Delia followed a few paces behind, saying little, watching the way the light moved across the plates of exposed rock at midday, whiter than she remembered it from childhood, though she supposed it had always been that white, and she had simply never had a reason to look so long. The land office man made the offer formal on the third visit. He set the papers on the tailgate of his truck rather than a desk, which she noticed and did not comment on, and read the terms aloud in the flat, courteous voice of someone who had read similar terms aloud many times before, to people who had not expected them. A signing bonus, a production royalty scaled to extraction volume, an option period, renewable, with numbers attached that she made him repeat once, not because she had misheard, but because she wanted to hear them again in the open air, over the ridge, instead of on a page. She asked for time before she signed anything, and he gave it without argument, the way people give things easily when they believe the answer is already decided. That night she drove out to the ridge alone, the way she used to when the ranch was still whole and there were fences to check before dark. The truck's tires found the same ruts they had always found, worn into the caliche by a decade of the same route, and she let the engine idle a moment before she cut it, listening to the tick of it cooling in the silence that followed. Above her, the sky was doing what it always did at that hour, going from white to a bruised gold, and then to something almost violet at the edges, indifferent to lithium prices and probate courts and men in ties. She sat on the tailgate with the empty tool bag beside her, its false lining slack now, its purpose spent, and she thought that there ought to be some ceremony for a moment like this, and found there was none, only the wind moving through the creosote and the sound of her own breathing, steady, the way it had always been steady, over a decade of work no one had thought worth watching. 1 year and 4 months after the funeral, she came back to that same ridge at dawn instead of dusk, because dawn was the hour her grandfather had always walked it, before the heat rose and the cattle needed him, and the day belonged to other people's demands. The Basin and Range engineers had come and gone the week before, driving their white trucks over the caliche and leaving stakes with pink flagging tape that would, within a year, mark the edges of a lease worth more than the entire ranch had ever earned in 40 seasons of cattle and drought. She had signed nothing yet that could not be undone, nothing that traded patience for haste, and Mr. Halbrook had told her, in the dry voice of a man who had spent 2 decades watching families come apart over less, that this was the wisest thing about her, that she read every line before she signed it, the way her grandfather had read weather before he trusted it. Trent had called once, in the flat tone of a man rehearsing generosity he did not feel, suggesting that family ought to find some arrangement, that blood counted for something even now. She had let the call end without raising her voice. Whitney had not called at all, only posted, weeks later, a photograph of a Newport dinner, with a caption about resilience that made no mention of ridges, or lithium, or the parcel she had sold for $9,000, believing it was nothing. Delia stood now with the tool bag hanging empty from her hand, its leather gone soft and pale where the false bottom had been cut away and mended plain, no longer hiding anything because there was nothing left to hide. The ridge below her caught the first flat light of morning the way it always had, indifferent, patient, holding its mineral wealth the way it had held it for millions of years before anyone thought to want it. She thought of her grandfather walking this same line before the heart attack, before the barn, before any of it, checking fences that no longer needed checking, and she understood, standing there, that he had not left her a fortune so much as he had left her the only thing he trusted completely, the fact that she would not go looking for it, that she would simply keep doing the work in front of her until the work itself proved her worth it. The wind moved through the creosote the way it always had. She did not feel triumphant. She felt instead exactly the way she had felt every morning for 10 years before this one, steady, unhurried, and entirely